Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the time to be a part of this discussion. I'm Callum. I'll be your moderator for the evening. My involvement in the food systems world is that I co-organise an urban farm called Caring Farms Cooperative down here in northeast Melbourne on Wurundjeri Willem country. And I feel really grateful, eternally grateful really, to be living and working here, and would like to start off in paying my respects to the elders past and present that continue to care for this country and continue to fight to care for this country in the fact that sovereignty has never been ceded. And as an individual and as kind of the collective that I represent, I think it's really important to keep that in mind in all the work that we do. And if you feel up for it, would be really interested to know which country you're coming in from today. If you want to put it in the chat, it's really interesting in these sort of online spaces to see from all across the nation the different places that people come from. So yeah, feel free to do that. I will quickly say that this session is part of a collection of sessions called the Degrowth Network Week. I'll just share my screen real quick. There we go. The Degrowth Week. So this is the 9th of 10 sessions that have been going all week. So they'll be online in perpetuity. So you can go back and catch all of the brilliant speakers that have spoken so far. That's like not a complete list, but I've only attended 2, but they've been brilliant so far on all different topics, all things degrowth. The week's been set up by the Degrowth Network Australia, which has a little bio line there and a way to get in touch with them if you want to continue this discussion further along, and also done in conjunction with the New Economy Network Australia, which is a brilliant network. And then just to kind of ground us and to give us a little context, here's a little slide that gives kind of a brief overview of what degrowth as a theory and as a movement kind of means. Not sure from which kind of context lots of you have come from. I'm more of the kind of food and food systems. So degrowth as a theory is new to me. So yeah, this is what I found quite a helpful kind of overview of it. But our speakers will talk more to it as we go along. And how this session will run is that we will have 3 speakers, all of which I'm very excited to hear about. I admire the work of all of them, and I think they do really important and interesting research and practice. So each of them will speak for about 10 minutes. We're not going to time it, so they'll be free to talk as long as they want if they want to. And then as we go along, put your questions into the chat or just like type in hand up. And after the speakers, we can start opening up to questions and then broader discussion. See if I've got everything down. Yeah, cool. Well, we can begin. First off, we're going to have Tammi Jonas speaking, who is a practicing agroecologist and also the president of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance. I've been the beneficiary of a lot of her work throughout all of my farming career. The Alliance continues to do really important work on multiple fronts, both in advocacy and in information. And I'm really excited to hear what she has to say about the intersection between food systems and degrowth. So if you're ready, Tammi, take it away.
Thanks, Callum, and thanks to everyone in the Degrowth Network for bringing us all together tonight. It's actually really gratifying to be in a degrowth specific space, and it was nice to put together some thinking around degrowth and agroecology, because although I work on this a lot in life and in scholarship, I kind of realized they're one and the same thing, and you're about to find out why I think that. So I'd like to first acknowledge that I'm joining all of you tonight from the unceded lands of the Jara, and pay my respects to elders and ancestors and any other First Peoples who are here with us tonight. And here on our farm, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, we're guided by ethics of fairness, and central to that, I think, is like the notion of enoughness, which I know is not a word, but I think that when you think about fairness, it's good to think about what is enough for everyone and how can we all have enough. So we talk about it here all the time, about giving and receiving mutual aid, commensurate with our need and our capacity as community members here on the farm. And so if sustainability, is dealing justly with future generations, as they say, it obviously has to start right now and with the current generations in our dealings with the human and more than human world. I'm going to share a quick story about something that happened here on the farm. We had a welcome to country earlier in the year to announce the coming together of Tampaneri growers and us on the farm, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But at that event, Jara woman Beck Phillips welcomed us to country, and when she did it, she shared some thoughts on relations with country that have become really core to the way that I think about relations. And they help to explicate things that I've been thinking and feeling and eating my way into for quite a long time. She pointed out that humans are 60% water. And she said, so if you're 60% water and you drink from the Loddon River, then you're 60% Loddon. And it's like so obvious, right? But it was just a really nice example. And then she said, so if you're 60% Loddon, then you're also, if you're eating food from that country, you're country. And that's how Jara consider themselves kin with country. And I've thought about these things for a long time, but that captured it differently and nicely for me because I think about food so much. We drink rainwater here. So thinking about where our rains come from, I actually looked at our weather patterns, and they mostly come from Ngarrindjeri and Gunditjmara country. And because that's where the water in the sky is seeded from, basically. So then it flows back to recharge Ngarrindjeri and several other countries. And one of the denizens here on the farm, Josh, of Tampaneri growers, is actually Ngarrindjeri. And so it's actually made all of us think more about the way that what we're doing here is nourishing his ancestral terrain and how it's nourishing ours, and how our responsibility to care for our soils actually relates quite directly to caring for the healthy water where he comes from, just as Ngarrindjeri and Gunditjmara and Jara and all the others have been keeping country healthy for so very, very long, so many thousands of years. I'm going to talk now about agroecology as a science, a set of practices, and a social movement, and a way of farming in harmony that predates capitalist agriculture, although it becomes a movement in the 70s, before grounding it by sharing some examples from here on our farm. And embedded in agroecology is the understanding of our responsibilities and reciprocities of our mutual obligations in relations with both land and people. And the first thing I need to do after having pointed out all those connections is a quick reminder to all of us here in the global north, aka the minority world, that we constitute just 20% of the world's population, but we consume 80% of its resources. And I think that's super important for us always to remember as we grapple with the cascading crises of climate change and biodiversity loss, growing hunger here and globally, and acknowledging that our countries are overwhelmingly the cause of these crises. And that while we may be insignificant in numbers, our negative impacts are enormous. And that's not fair, right? So a lot of what we do in AFSA and here on our farm is thinking about, well, how can we be fair to the majority of the world? You all know that capitalism is driven by profit and that it constantly increases production, selling its products based on exchange values that are pretty much divorced from the value of their use, and also from the real cost of production, including their social and ecological costs. And capitalist agriculture specifically produces something that John Bellamy Foster calls the metabolic rift, based on a kind of Marxian analysis, meaning the unsustainable relation of capital to the soil. Quite specific, based on the systemic disruption of the nutrient cycle through the separation of food production and food consumption. And so he talks a lot about the rural-urban divide. And I think the pictures there kind of show clearly that it's a problem not shitting where you eat. So I know that sounds weird, but it's true. In contrast, in pre-capitalist societies, production was conducted for the sake of satisfying our concrete needs. And so the aim of production was use values that were actually tied to the fulfillment of finite wants. Agroecology advocates a post-capitalist future where everyone's needs are met without exploiting people or mistreating animals and without exceeding our planetary boundaries. And many degrowthers articulate this as a life of frugal abundance that provides radical sufficiency for all. So where capitalist commodity agriculture delivers this world agriculture, which is literally food from nowhere, agroecology delivers place-based, community-centered systems, which is food from somewhere, like in my case, like quite literally from here. And that supports our relations with country, which supports our relations with each other. Sometimes people ask me whether agroecology of peasants and indigenous peoples can feed the world. And, just to deal with that quickly, it already does. 70% of the world is fed by smallholders with just 30% of the land. And industrial production is using 70% of the land to produce 30% of our food. So another way to think about this is, Australians often see vast monocultures of grain and believe that this is what we need to eat. But most Australian grain is actually exported, and more than half of it's eaten by non-human animals or converted to biofuels. Australia is not feeding the world. We don't even actually manage to feed all Australians, with as much as 15% of the population experiencing food insecurity in the past year alone. And instead, we allow those in control to sell our water and soil in the form of commodities to middle-class societies overseas, to the detriment of smallholders and local communities on all sides of all seas. A little fact that I worked out, so 26% of our agricultural water, this is a stat from ABARES, goes to grow cotton. And they export 99% of it for the profit of about 1,500 cotton farms in Australia. So 26% of agricultural water in this country goes to the profits of 0.006% of the population. It doesn't seem very fair to me. But there's good news. It doesn't have to be this way. In many parts of the world, it's still not this way. Those smallholders are constantly under threat from land grabbers and development agencies who sometimes are actually the same. Spending time with small-scale food producers, like in this photo here from the majority world, has heavily influenced my utopian thinking, which some people think is like, oh, she's such a dreamer. But actually, Ruth Levitas asserts that it's an informed, educated hope. And so we're going to come away from today feeling all a little bit more utopian in a really good and productive way. And the first necessary step in utopia as method is to transform our criticism of a particular state of affairs into a genuine estrangement or alienation with that particular situation. Let me show you what alienation looks like here at our farm. On unceded Jajawaran country here, what they call Jandak, we've been practicing our alienation from the hegemony of capitalism for several years. Let me share some of the ways we found this alienation so joyfully communal and deeply relational. We raise heritage breed large black pigs and speckle-line cattle on pasture, and we have a small crop of hardneck purple garlic as well. And now we share the land rent-free in relations of reciprocity with Tampanyeri growers, which is a market garden run by Ngarrindjeri and Narunga man Josh and settler Rex. In a slowly developing, we only just started this arrangement last December, biodiverse silvi-agriculture system, establishing what we all hope is a beacon for the principles and practices of agroecology. Our livestock here are fed surplus produce from other food and agriculture systems, so mostly brewers' grain and whey from local producers, creating a net ecological benefit by diverting many tons of organic so-called waste from landfill. While the animals are currently slaughtered off-site, the carcasses come back here for further processing in the on-farm butcher shop, where I'm the lead mindful meat smith, along with a team that helped me. and surplus nutrient is processed now in a rotating drum composting vessel that we affectionately call Audrey, that was built by my bricklayer husband, Stuart. And that completes its paddock-to-paddock cycle and becomes rich fertilizer for Tampinieri's vegetables. 95% of our produce is sold to about 80 household CSA members who commit to sharing the abundance and risks of the farm in a solidarity economy. And if you look at the farm blog, you'll see that we've had to share some of those risks, and we've also shared those rewards over the dozen years that we've been doing this. And the small remainder sold through a farm gate shop, which is largely a lure to get people to come and see what it looks when animals are raised on pastures. So they'll hopefully never eat animals raised in sheds ever again. We're now working on a not-for-profit micro abattoir to service our farm and 15 others. Tuesday of next week, Council will announce its decision on whether they're approving the development. And that will also operate on relations rather than transactions, which is like everything we do here. Farmers will be members and share in the decision-making, including around pricing and scheduling and animal welfare matters. And they'll be charged only the cost of processing and direct labor, with no profit extracted from the system by us nor any distant investors. And that's how everything is run here at Jonas. We embrace degrowth to ensure sufficiency for all, including us, and we value conviviality and mindful appreciation of the fruits of our labor, stopping to enjoy 3 meals together each and every day. And we share the benefits of our use of Jandak in what we hope is a temporarily transactional kind of restitution by paying the rent. I'm going to finish by just saying our commitment to degrowth is really deeply embedded in this pursuit of agroecology, which I said, I think they just equal each other, really, which is farming in harmony with nature. Agroecology sequesters carbon, it halts and reverses biodiversity loss, it brings control of the food system and decision-making power back into the hands of local communities. Agroecology deals justly with future generations by responding to nature's pretty obvious cues as to how much is enough, enabling us to enjoy just relations with country and with the human and more than human world that she supports. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tammi. Fascinating stuff. I hadn't had the opportunity to hear much about the farming work that you do in practice. Largely just heard about the Alliance. So it's amazing to see these things. Going in practice. And what Tammi's been talking about, I think, flows really nicely into our next speaker in Terry, who is a conjoint lecturer in sociology at the University of Newcastle. I know him as a brilliant writer of all things food systems and degrowth, and as the kind of mainly through his website, the gifteconomy.org, which I'm a big fan of, but also really enjoyed his chapter in the book Food and Degrowth, where he talked really interestingly and really broke down what degrowth in food systems looks like in practice. So yeah, take it away, Terry.
Thank you so much, Callum. Let's see if I can share the screen. Yeah, share. Yeah, is that right? Okay, good. Well, thanks very much. That was a wonderful talk from Tammi, and I think what you're doing is really amazing and terrific. So I'd like to talk about the general topic of degrowth and food and what wait a minute, I need to anyway, and what a degrowth landscape might look like. So I'm going to start off with the research done by Melbourne Food Future organisation. And what they found was that a land area equivalent to 72% of the state of Victoria is required to provide Melbourne's food needs. And the per capita land footprint is 3.8 hectares, meaning that's basically the amount of land people are using to grow the food that they're eating each. or 19 hectares for a household of 5 people, which I'll be talking about that later on. 90% of that land is for sheep and cattle. So there are various reasons why we need to degrow our use of resources in producing food. And I'll just mention some of these. The machinery on farms, which uses fossil fuels, a massive amount of transport by sea, air and road of food from all parts of the world and from all parts of Australia. The fertilizer and pesticides, which are a normal part of most agriculture, commercial agriculture, and these use oil as a feedstock to create these things. Packaging of food, which is part of the transport and commercial sale of food, the storage and refrigeration that goes with that, powered irrigation. Almost all of these energy uses are powered by fossil fuels. There's also a limit in replacing fossil fuels with renewable. I won't go into this in any detail, but just to say that if we move to totally renewables, we'd run out of the minerals that we need to make these various things. People underestimate the storage needs and costs with renewables. There's the difficulties of moving to a hydrogen economy. There's the problems of extractivism in terms of the global south and how we're sort of ruining their lives through extracting the resources we need for these renewable energies. These problems are exacerbated if we continue with a growth economy, which for a 3% growth rate, which is considered normal, it means a doubling every 23 years. So the estimate of the costs of moving to a totally renewable system from Ted Trainer is that cost would be close to 50% of GDP. In other words, it's completely unaffordable, while the present costs of energy are closer to 5% of GDP. And Ted reckons that the global average of energy from renewables could only supply 5%, 10%, say, of what is now available on average per capita from fuels in rich countries, from fossil fuels. Another problem is the problem of phosphates, which Tammi talked about. Basically, phosphates are minerals required by plants. When you take the plant up and move it out of that area and send it to the city to be eaten, the phosphates go with the plant. There's a resulting soil deficiency of phosphates, which is supplied with fertilizers. We're running out of the accessible reserves of phosphates, which we mine to produce these fertilizers. The most sensible solution is recycling human waste using manure and compost. In a globalized food economy with large cities, and that would imply transport and energy use. In other words, we'd be moving manure and compost from the rural areas and from other places around the world and stuff like that. It's completely impracticable. So there are various implications from these kind of basic sort of technological facts, if you like, of the situation. We need to localize agriculture to reduce energy use in transport. We need to localize agriculture to make it easy to recycle manure. We need to move to organic agriculture that's not using toxic pesticides and herbicides. We need to avoid the extra energy use and transport energy by moving to a local agriculture where we're just moving things closely from one place to another. And we need to move to organics to avoid the toxic effects of the pesticides we're now using and to save biodiverse environments. Now, what I've done quite a lot of research in Africa, and it's been on subsistence food systems and projects to ensure food security in those systems. Most of the time, these projects work on an entrepreneurial model and don't actually do anything useful. But anyway, what they have given me, the subsistence projects, which were based on that and using organic agriculture and permaculture and agroecology techniques, were much more successful. And from that, I've developed a sort of a summary of where I think is the requirement in land size for a household of 5 people. And as you can see, I've worked out how much land is used from growing the maize that they need to grow food for their poultry, the land that's being used for the house itself and vegetables and the poultry run and the orchard, and that comes out at 0.866 hectares per household of 5 people. I'm looked into the situation of Melbourne. Now I'm having trouble. Wait a minute, this could work. Yes, that's better. To see if it's actually sustainable to have Melbourne supplied by its own urban agriculture. And basically what I found in terms of how much land is available, even including land in parks and on the sides of railway lines and small feeder roads in suburbs and so on, digging all of that up and growing food on it, we're still down to, for a household of 5, we're getting between 0.074 hectares. That's compared with the 0.8 that I talked about before, and 0.122 hectares at a small scale, with suburbs that are poorer and have less land. So it's basically, my argument is that urban agriculture can't actually feed large cities such as Melbourne. Okay, what's happening here? That works. I won't go into this in any detail, but obviously if we were going to use firewood for heating and cooking, we'd need even more land. And for a household of 5, I estimated about 5.82 hectares. There's no way to transport this amount of firewood to cities without using fossil fuel energy. In other words, what I'm saying is we wouldn't have enough renewable energy to make that a feasible idea. The broad implications of this is that for a long-term sustainable future, we would need to radically decentralise. So villages and towns would handle their own food needs using local manure sources, using animal-powered carts and bicycles. They'd be surrounded by forests and woodlands. I'm not saying that this implies an isolated sort of parochial kind of mindset. In fact, these communities could be connected by train services running on solar and wind power and using the internet. I'd like to now use the example of the Chikukwa project in Zimbabwe, which is a 20-year project, just to give you an idea of what that kind of food system might look like on the ground. This provides a diverse, healthy and sufficient diet and so on, maintains the soils, a landscape of woodlots, indigenous zones and agricultural plots. So I'll just show you what the place looked like before the project began in the 90s, really bare hills, soils massively compacted down, overgrazed, there's no tree cover, lots of erosion. So even in the rainy season, houses would silt up or to the window frames. There's another picture of it, very dry, very barren, very packed down and so on. They created community working bees to fence off the gullies. This is an example of that. And they had huge community working parties to create swales and contour bunds. The new landscape is a landscape of farmsteads surrounded by orchards with vegetable plots, maize fields, woodlots, and contour bunds. So there's one picture of it. So you can see that can do that, yeah. The little houses here, down here, we've got a patch of bananas. We've basically got a little orchard around this house here, and then this is the cropping field. We'll get to the next one. This is another shot. What it shows is that the ridges were planted. They planted fast-growing eucalypts, which they also use for building and firewood for cooking. There's a little kraal there, I'm sorry, not a kraal, a little Rondeville house. That'd be the kitchen, and there's a house there. In this gully here, that's indigenous plants there that'd be protected by a fence. There's another lot of plants going down here. You can see how the contour bunds run across the slope, creating the soil fertility. This is Konde Matsekete, and that's the swale that goes across his maize field, and then there's another one there. And this is a neighbouring house, but you can see there's an old indigenous tree there, and then an orchard below that, a very typical pattern. What it means is that the rainwater from the house goes down into the orchard first, and then they have the vegetable plot at the bottom. This is them making water tanks for the neighbourhood. So they restored the springs, and then they were able to create neighbourhood water tanks. These fed to each individual house with poly pipes, and there'd be a tap in this house. And again, you can see that the excess water is going down the slope to their orchard. This is a restored spring and gully of indigenous plants. What this shows is a maize field with a woodlot behind it. And on the right hand down there, there's some piles of manure. We'll see them again in a minute. This is a little orchard. This is a neighbourhood orchard. It's Martha Shumba and her friend, her neighbour. This is a mixed household orchard. And then each household has its own vegetable gardens. Here, this is a cropping field with maize and beans interplanted as a legume crop. This is another vegetable plot, a kind of cabbage which can be grown from cuttings. A pumpkin plot, obviously, with bananas in the riverbed next to the river. Small livestock was really common, so for protein, and here they've got pigeons, goats, and chickens. This is Olivia Mazoyo, and there's a pigeon coop, whatever, and hen's eggs. The goats were kept inside, whereas previously they destroyed everything. And this is the compost that they're using an ox cart here to distribute the compost and manure on their maize plots. So I'll finish up by just saying there are a number of strategies which we can use for the present: urban agriculture, the organics movement, obviously agroecology that Tammi talked about, people opting to be vegetarians or vegans and trying to resist the sort of animal cruelty associated with commercial farming at the moment, buying local in season, trying to ban nicotinoids, which are obviously having a huge effect on insects, saving the Murray-Darling and Barrier Reef from export agriculture. So these are the sort of kind of projects which are ongoing at the moment, where people are involved in trying to make a dent in the kind of capitalist food economy that we've got at the moment. In the longer term, I think we actually need a revolution to overthrow capitalism, though I think that could happen might happen very gradually. We need the occupation of rural land. People from the cities need to move out to rural land, decentralization. And I think the only economic system that can actually work is a non-monetary, non-market socialism, or the gift economy. So in terms of land use, if you work it out in terms of what I talked about before, only 2.4% of land in Victoria would be needed to provide all the food needs for the current Melbourne population. That's compared to 72% of Victorian land currently required just for food. One of the reasons for the smaller print is using less land for large livestock. If we had land to provide firewood, we could be using 24% of Victorian land, and we may well opt to have more land used for large livestock and run that sustainably, like as on Tammi's farm. Okay, and I'll finish up with that. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Terry. Some really interesting broad implications from that work there, and the comments I've got lots of questions for you about what that looks like in practice, but we can chat about that, and also how I think that ties into what Tammi and Jonas Farms are doing after we hear from Kerry. Are you ready to go, Kerry? Cool. Yes. Brilliant. Kerry is a PhD candidate and research assistant at the Centre for Sustainable Communities at the University of Canberra. His research work explores everything from how care is practiced in vegetable farms in Victoria, which I'm very interested in, to how smallholder farmers make their livelihoods in northwest Cambodia. So broad, but with similar sort of threads going through them. And also he's a small-scale farmer of garlic, which I find really interesting as well. So take it away, Kerry.
Thanks, Callum, and thanks, Tammi and Terry. Really very interesting and excellent presentations. I'm just going to share a screen as well. I was actually going to talk through some stuff and I realized I was using too many stats and stuff, and it wouldn't have made much sense to anyone. So there's that. I really love the agrarian utopias that Tammi and Terry have spoken about, and that's certainly something that I'm in favour of personally. I'm going to take a little bit of a different route though, and perhaps talk about maybe what I think is some pragmatic or practical approaches to degrowth. I'd like to also then talk about an ontological or metaphysical concern that relates to degrowth and food. But I'm not sure I'll get there in the 10 minutes. So we'll see, maybe that will come out in discussion. Plus, I think that Tammi, particularly with agroecology, had already kind of touched on that in any case. So I research vegetable farming and care, and I'm going to give a little bit of an overview, a brief overview of the vegetable markets, vegetable supply chains in Australia. So this first slide, as you can see, practices that probably do not support degrowth, really highlight that the retail share of trade dollar for vegetables is really captured by Coles, Woolworths and Aldi at 77.4%. So it's really massive. And you can see that other supermarkets, which would be, I guess, IGA, Foodworks, etc., capturing 10.6%. And then finally, you've got greengrocers markets, specialty stores at 12%. So the annual household consumption of vegetables, 116.6 kilograms, which is actually very, very low. As I'm sure many people are aware, Australians eat very little vegetables. I think only 1 in 10 people eats the recommended daily intake of vegetables. There's a lot of scope for much more vegetables to be eaten. When we combine this together, this is imperfect, I should add, by the way, if you haven't already realized, we're getting towards, 1.259 million tons of vegetables that are purchased through retailers every year in Australia. So that's really a huge amount. That's based on multiplying this by the 10.8 million households in Australia. So people that supply these farms are very often large commercial, the supermarkets, sorry, are very often large commercial growers. And the trend with vegetable farming in Australia, just like, which is a trend across farming, is that vegetable farms are getting bigger, smaller farmers are disappearing. And also the big farms account for the lion's share of production as well. This data is getting a little bit old here, but ABARES used to do a really great survey called the Vegetable Growing Farm Survey. It's really great for people interested in vegetable growing. Unfortunately, they haven't done it for about 6 years, so that's no good. So the takeaway here, I guess, is that people in Australia largely get vegetables from supermarkets, which are getting it often increasingly directly from large commercial growers that are using a conventional approach. Obviously, what's not captured here is people also eating takeaway and at restaurants and so on and so forth. Institutions as well, and they might get their food through wholesalers or providors. So that's not captured in the data, and that's not insignificant amount. So then practices that can support degrowth, I mean, there's a range, Terry's mentioned some. We've got community gardens in Australia. The Community Garden Australia, the organisation, lists 702 community gardens, 194 of them here in Victoria. The CSA network, Australia and New Zealand, suggests there's 37 CSAs. I'm not sure of the accuracy of that. And Tammi, you might be able to say that that's wrong. And I wouldn't be surprised because on that list, there's definitely CSAs that don't actually exist as CSAs anymore. So I'm sure there's some that do exist that are not on it. Cooperatives, I couldn't find a figure on this. I'm not sure there are too many vegetable cooperatives around Australia. I know that cooperatives were a bit more of a thing in the dairy industry, but I don't have a figure on that. Possibly more promising is, even though, despite what Terry has said, possibly more promising for vegetable growing at least, is backyard gardening and front yard gardening and verge gardening. So way back in 2013, the Australian Institute found that 52% of people they surveyed grew some food at home, which I was actually quite surprised. That seems really quite high to me, but there you go. What they didn't do, though, is quantify how much food people are growing at home. So I've cobbled together a survey that was done through Sustain with Nick Rose and Kelly Donati, the Pandemic Gardeners Survey. And in that, they found that half the people that responded, they were all gardeners, grew less than 10% of their food. And you can see the other stats there. So the picture that we're getting here is that actually very few vegetables are produced outside of commercial growers and supermarket and wholesaler chains. So I guess what we're asking here, though, from a degrowth perspective, is that we want to shift production and distribution from that first slide, from the supermarkets, from commercial growers using heaps of industrial inputs, to practices that are more aligned with degrowth, because they don't treat food as much as a commodity or value it simply for its profits. The issue here is, as I mentioned, that could be in the order of 1.259 million tons of vegetables. If people were to eat the actual recommended daily intake of vegetables, that increases it to over 3 million tons. Now, I'm sure we've got people here that grow vegetables. We've definitely got people that grow vegetables who are living in this. And we know that it's hard work, right? And it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of labor. Terry, you've spoken about the land already. And that's something that has been investigated a bit as well for vegetable growing, where people find that there would be enough lawns, for instance, in cities to grow vegetables. Obviously not everyone has lawns though. But the thing that I'm kind of interested in is, what about people's willingness and the labor that would be required if we're not using fossil fuels to grow these vegetables as well? And that would be quite significant. I'm not necessarily convinced that there is a widespread willingness. And this gets to, those utopian visions and revolution, everything that hopefully we can shift enough people to have the willingness to do that. The other thing that's a really pressing issue is that the supermarkets and commercial growers aren't going to just step aside either. And they're really, really, really massive organizations, as we know. So what do we do with those actors in the food networks? So that's just some questions to think about. I'm not saying that I have answers to those necessarily, but from a degrowth perspective in vegetables, it's very important to think about. I should mention in my research, I work with both commercial grower, large scale grower, and also a small scale kind of market vegetable farming as well. So here, often when I think about degrowth, I see it, advocates and activists and research often takes what I call a politics of opposition. So on the one hand, we've got things that are consistent with a degrowth ethic or degrowing world, like food sovereignty movements, farmers markets, community supported agriculture, and so on. And on the other side, we've got things that are definitely out because they're just too capitalist, right? Conventional agriculture, supermarkets. I've got organic, biodynamic, regenerative agriculture in the middle, because obviously practices can float between being capitalist or being anti-capitalist, I think. The problem though with this is that I think that it's capitalocentric, in that it always holds capitalism as a hegemonic force, and everything else is either subordinate to capitalism or alternative to capitalism, but they're all within the orbit of capitalism, which is the point from which we depart. So I'm wondering, can we transgress, or can we depart from these kinds of binaries, or what I have like to call food wars? And so I'm part of a community economies research network, which was started largely by the work of J.K. Gibson Graham, that you might have heard of, who are economic geographers. And they had this strategy, or they've popularized a strategy of reading for difference, or reading for economic diversity. So what they're saying, or what we're arguing, is that capitalism isn't something that comes before it's performed. It's something that's made. So any given farm, any given organization or business, whatever it may be, is performing in some ways capitalist modes of production and relations, and in other ways it might be enacting different kinds of economies. So I guess you could almost think of it as being more or less contributing to capitalism, I suppose. And this graph here from Koretsky and Fiola kind of breaks down what they see as the important relations of capitalism. And so you might say, well, if we have a farm, right, which kind of areas are they engaging in capitalist modes of relation and modes of being, and which ways are they not? So it's queering the economy. So I will talk about like this as queering farming or queering food networks. Like capitalism, I don't like to think about food systems, but instead food networks. And I see food networks like this image, which is actually of a computer network, internet network, I think. Seeing food networks as rhizomatic and always being in the process of being made, right? The farms don't exist. A vegetable farm doesn't exist prior to the work that the worms, the sun, the tractors, the humans, the fungi, microbiology are doing to actually enact that farm. So it's always open and can take different paths, right? The point of this is that together, I think these enact a kind of politics or facilitate a politics of possibility. It means also that possibilities for degrowth that might be foreclosed by an oppositional stance by saying that this is too capitalist, so it's not going to be, you know, amenable to a degrowth world, can be foreclosed by the opposition, and I think maybe it helps us to think about how we might find degrowth possibilities in unusual places. So I don't know about supermarkets. I'm not going to, that might be a stretch too far, but I'm thinking about commercial growers I've worked with, for instance, and are they open to degrowth possibilities? Even though they're using a lot of fossil fuels, they're using a lot of chemical pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, and they want to grow their businesses, right? And increasingly using packaging as well. So I think on the charge of reducing material and energy use, I think you can give commercial farmers a tick. Yes, there is a possibility that they could contribute to degrowth, right? And in fact, they already may be, with things like integrated pest management, using cover cropping and precision agriculture to reduce chemical fertilizer and pesticide inputs. You could electrify production and shifting obviously to organic production as well, increasingly. So I think there are ways that you could reduce the material impact of those farms. Plus, we also need to think about the idea that degrowth also means growing some things. So is replacing vegetable production, is replacing red meat and dairy with vegetables, apologies, a degrowth strategy in itself? It might well be. Can these farms, though, move away from growthism? I'm not so sure. And I think that question is a lot harder to answer. But I think with the politics of possibility, we can see that tomorrow is yet to be made. And I think there are some openings in the people I've spoken to. And this particularly comes with ideas about working with nature. I think that's still needs to, needs to develop into being a part of nature as opposed to working with, but maybe that's another step that we can take. And having ecological mindsets as well towards how they see their farm operating. So I think there is possibilities for them, but I wouldn't necessarily bet my life on that. So I think I've spoken, I don't know how long I've spoken for, but probably long enough. So I'm going to stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kerry. A lot to consider there, a lot to consider from all the talks. My head's kind of swimming in a good way. Now, we've got another about half an hour where we can open up the discussion, both to questions and amongst the speakers. So I'd encourage you, Terry, Kerry and Tammi, to unmute when you feel ready, and we can kind of make this as organic as an online conversation can go. We've got lots of different questions and threads going on in the chat room. Some of which a lot of which you've answered directly, Tammi, which is really brilliant. I might start us off with a question that I think kind of relates to all of the topics that you've been talking about so far. And I guess it goes to that idea of what does this transition or this revolution look like in practice? I wonder how we navigate the issue of capital in terms of both like what you talked about, Tammi, with Jonas farms, and the example that you gave in Zimbabwe, Terry, and then also as well, Kerry, when you talk about the amalgamation of smallholder farms to larger farms and the kind of trajectory that that's been taking. I know in my own practice, trying to run a small scale market garden, having enough capital to be able to begin these projects is a real barrier, especially when you're competing against these larger farms that already have inbuilt capital in their land ownership. If any of you had sort of thoughts or ideas about how we can put the power into, say, these more localized, potentially ruralized farms that just don't have the upfront capital to be able to establish. I wonder, Tammi, how you've navigated that at Jonas Farms, how you were able to set up the costs of it, and then, Terry or Kerry, any thoughts on how to, navigate that issue?
Thanks, Callum. I'm happy to have a stab at that as somebody who has built things without a ton of capital and without going into major debt with the banks. So we crowdfunded the Burning Room and the commercial kitchen back in 2013 and 14, and we raised $30,000 and $35,000 for the two facilities, which we converted from refrigerated shipping containers. And we did that by feeding those who supported the projects with what we produce, and we did it over time. So we didn't try to pay back $30,000 in a month. We did it it took a year of taking about 5% of what we were producing for our monthly income to feed back the people who supported us in being able to do what we do. And in building the abattoir, we're doing a similar basically project of crowdfunding and then paying people back over time. And also in this case, because of multiple farmers benefiting, they'll also be able to put in small amounts of money. But we build things at the speed of our bank balance. So we actually are, although sometimes I may not seem like it in person, I'm actually a very patient person. So I think but you got to the heart of the question in a number of ways. One is, we have all these smaller landholders and who are trying to work out how to make a living as we lose access to the what I'm now calling the intrinsic infrastructure of agroecology. It's not supply chain processing facilities. There's no chain and there's no middle. It's deeply intrinsic to being able to get food from farms to people who eat it. And so how do we regain control of that? It's certainly not by JBS, the largest meat packer in the world, just bought the abattoir that we use for the pigs, which is morally anathema to us to even have to do business with them, but we have no other choices. So hence we're building something here, and we're doing that collectively and without going into debt, without having investors. Nobody's going to get a return on this. The return is it's non-financial values. That's what the return is. And it's what and impact investors and all of those people to see the value of other kinds of returns. And I wish them well in that project, but meanwhile, we're busy ignoring the capitalists and just trying to get on with running capitalism.
Tammi, interject real quick. You're
the
cutting
lab
out
meat
a bit.
comment. Yep.
Maybe if you just
Why?
pop up your camera for a second.
Yeah, that's fine. See if this is better.
Yeah, that's
Do I sound clear now?
Yeah.
I would say rural internet, but I know in cities it's also terrible in Australia sometimes. I would just add, in terms of things like whether lab meat will solve the serious problems of intensive livestock production, which is the whole reason we started farming, they're the same thing for us. The question of how to solve the problems of intensive livestock production is not by concentrating more control of the food system in ever fewer hands, which is what things like lab meat is going to do, or is trying to do. But right now, delightfully, the investors aren't investing, as they're not seeing the returns to be as obvious as they would like. So for us, it's very much about local control of food systems in every way, in the ways Terry described, whether you're talking about in the suburbs or in the rural regions. Carrie didn't talk about it so much, but I know shares the values of that control needs to be within community hands, and the thinking that the iterative improvements made by commercial or capitalist farmers, we need every iteration we can get right now. It's grim times. So we should all be glad that's happening. It's improving those things, but we should be throwing ourselves at eroding the capitalist systems that are making those people make the choices they do, that are destroying the planet.
Amen.
Yeah.
Did you have something to say, Terry?
Yeah. Okay. For me, this issue of the transition. I mean, I didn't really talk about that, theoretically when I talk, but basically. I mean, in a way, look, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting you, Tammi, but what I would say is that the way Tammi envisages her cooperative is of a prefiguring institution that could become something within the context of a solidarity economy. And briefly, I'd say the solidarity economy involves a kind of benign state looking after a patchwork of market businesses run ethically by cooperatives of workers. Okay, so that's kind of one vision of a post-capitalist society, and you can see how she sees her activism within that kind of concept of transition. I think in terms of Gibson Graham, the idea of making an assessment of various aspects of a particular project, whether it's a sort of capitalist commercial project or intentionally anti-capitalist subsistence project and anything in between, is the way they look at it. And they also think that these prefigurative forms can continue on to create a new post-capitalist society. I mean, basically they think that, as Kerry said, that it's capitalocentric to think that capitalism dominates everything, and so that we can move beyond it by just stressing various community and ethical aspects of particular practices. So my kind of view of all of this is really different. I mean, I take these transitional and prefigurative organizations as what I've called hybrids of the gift economy and capitalism. And to read more about that, you should have a look at Politics of Permaculture, which is now available from Pluto, free of charge, open access, etc. But basically, what I mean by that is that I think that they exist within various ways within the capitalist economy and make sense within that market economy, and also have various aspects of the gift economy within them. Like for example, in the case of Tammi's farm, of a cooperative controlled by its workers and involving the community, and there's a whole range of things. And I think Gibson Graham also talks about how to assess this, but the way I'd be looking at it is in that way. And my kind of overview of the situation is these are transitional prefigurative strategies that make sense in the context of the domination of capitalism that we have in the present situation, and that if we're looking at a post-capitalist economy, these kind of prefigurative institutions, if they became dominant, would cease to be what they are now. they would become purely gift economy and non-monetary alternatives without money being used by purely voluntary and community bodies like a commoning and so on. So that's how I look at it. And the other thing I'd be saying about all of this is that it doesn't matter where we look at these prefigurative institutions of the present time, is that they suffer from the domination of the capitalist economy. They struggle to exist in this context. You know, like so with the Chikukwa project, you know, they had a huge fight from the owners of the cattle who wanted to resist the kind of control of cattle that the community organization was setting up. And these people were defending their private property interests in cattle. You know, it made sense for them to be doing that. And you know, they basically tried to sabotage the community organization, which is doing all this other wonderful stuff. That's just one example. I mean, another example is a CSA farm, which we probably all know about in England, where the people involved worked themselves to death and then their house burned down, and they were relieved that had happened. And I mean, that partly what that illustrated was the difficulty of combining ethical gift economy practice in the context of a capitalist economy, which means to say, which doesn't mean we should stop doing it. We should do it as much as we can, but we can't expect it to be easy. That's all I'd say.
Absolutely. Terry, while we've got you, there's been a lot of conversation in the chat about your kind of call for decentralization of populations as like a, you know, overall longer term sort of need. People have been asking, does this just look like urbanization on steroids? How do we navigate distributing populations on this sort of scale without encroaching on our already precious little natural habitats?
Yeah, okay. So what I'd say about that is two things. One is, as we leave the cities, we create natural habitat. In the areas which are now occupied by cities, we could have natural habitat. The other thing that I'd be saying about it is that when we look at the footprint, we only need 2.4% of Victoria's land to be devoted to food production if we're just using small livestock. Even if we go for, you know, burning wood to heat our houses, which is 24%, there is a lot of land left over for biodiversity, for native forests and things of that type. It's not necessarily a problem. I mean, in terms of how to do it, I envisage it happening at the present time as people making choices to go and live in the country, you know, and then gradually the rail infrastructure gets increased, and then hopefully the government decides to run the rail lines on solar power or something like that. It's like, that's a sort of incremental reformist kind of analysis of it. The other possibility is a revolution to the gift economy, where people just start sort of setting up voluntary bodies to sort of dismantle the houses in the city and move them out to the country, to set up the new rail lines and the new kind of powering up of those rail lines that we need, and so on, as a kind of community project.
Obviously, Rod, you've got your hand up if you want to jump in.
Oh, thanks. Might be jumping the queue, but it's direct related to what Terry was just talking about. I'm curious about, there's a whole lot of infrastructure in the metropolis, right? So just my emotionality maybe imagines half the people moving out, and then so maybe the direct question for Terry is, can we move grains and pulses around on this renewable powered rail system, and maybe even shipping, you know, sales, shipping and stuff like that.
What about the compost and manure?
Oh yeah, that too. Yeah.
And
all right.
I mean, I'm not saying any of this is impossible, and like, I'd like to put a question mark over that whole argument. You know, it's sort of like, okay, let's think about what this might look like, and that's my inclination is to think this is probably the easiest way to make it all work. But I'm not, you know, vastly committed to it or anything. You know, I like living in a city myself, and you know,
Obviously,
on the other hand, when you start,
no, you go.
Some of these things start to look really difficult. Yeah.
So obviously, it's a web between the technical and the social, I guess.
Yeah.
Or, the material and the human, or whatever we want to, however we think about it. Yeah, huge, amazing. Thanks.
NENA, I see you've got your hand up. I hope I pronounced your name right.
Hello, I'm kind of a rule breaker. I think everyone is the same here. So I have an experiment question for the audience. We have been talking about degrowth, non-monetary economies, and building community. And I would love to know, I cannot see the answer, but I want to ask to the audience, it's supposed 46 people here. I want to ask the audience, how many of them have used non-monetary economies with their friends, with their family? Can you see if they can have a reaction, like the love heart, for example? Can you see how many of them? Because sometimes...
yeah, we're getting lots of hands up.
Okay, good.
Up. It's hard to give a...
More than 20? I'm just interested to see.
Oh, absolutely
more than 50%.
Yeah.
I went for the party symbol, but yeah.
Cool. This means we are in the same page then, because I think I have the feeling that sometimes we stay too much in the theory, but we don't take action. So, well, I'm feeling with my tribe because all of us have a love for non-monetary economies and for growing food and generate sovereignty through connection with the land. So now I have two questions, and it's one about like a big picture about agriculture. And this could be for you, Callum, or for Tammi, and it's about enoughness. During the weekend, I was in a farm that was almost 600 acres, and was a permaculture land, permaculture farm, and I'm a permaculturist, but I did have this feeling like, wow, when is enough? It's like they weren't using all the land. So my question is about redistribution. I do want 2 acres of land, but now I'm asking myself, why I don't want 2 acres just for myself? When is enough? And how we can achieve more social justice in cases like mine. I'm a migrant woman. I just finished my studies. So I don't think I will have like kind of access for a long-term land. How we can achieve a more fair way of integrating the people who is passionate for working with land in spaces where the land is not all used, and a lot of the big properties are in hands of, I don't want to say like elder people. So then they don't work in the land because they can't, or sometimes it's like family business, and they don't have much labor, so they don't use all the land. So when is enough? I have that question. And my other question could be for Terry or Kerry, about what's the possibility to grow food in public spaces? Because I think we have too many parks and we just have lawn. Can we reclaim the lawn and plant fruit trees and grow green leaves or legumes? What do you think? Even in the nature strip, how we can, especially this question is for Terry. I don't know if he explored this alternative in his research, or maybe Terry through the years, I don't know if he has seen some experiences made here or overseas about food forest or growing food in public spaces. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go with the first question first. I'll jump in before you can go, Tammi, in the idea of enoughness, which is like, we've got a couple of comments of that in the chat. It's something that's really resonated. It's really interesting how those simple kind of phrases can really connect. At least when I think about enoughness and that idea that you brought up, NENA, of how we can deal with the problem of land ownership. And I know Kerry thinks about this as well when it comes to like worker owner cooperatives. That's what we do at the kind of farm that I co-manage. It's a worker cooperative in which the land is leased. We don't have the resources to be able to buy it ourselves, but have a good lease agreement. And our cooperative is made up of a whole different group of people with different backgrounds and different abilities. And what we've seen in practice is that when you have things that are collectively managed in that way, the idea of enoughness is kind of taken care of, in that like you have this situation in which people come together and you're able to see eye to eye what people are needing in that moment, and that might change over time. But I've been really heartened to see how readily people are able to, or like willing to give up the kind of more that they have when they see other people within this cooperative need it, and then vice versa in different times. So it's like a legal structure. I find cooperatives are the way of the future, and I would imagine the rest of the speakers agree. Do you have anything more to say on that, Tammi, about enoughness?
Yeah, I think the Food Sovereignty Alliance has been working on the question of access to land and secure tenure on land for quite a long time. And we have an entire program of work called Farming on Other People's Land, FUPL, which is also acknowledging that if you're not Indigenous in Australia, we're all farming on other people's land. And so while we work at connecting more people to land for food growing, we want to acknowledge that for all of us who are second peoples, in doing that, we're constantly back on unceded land. And so not losing sight of that colonial problem and making land available to more First Peoples as well in a variety of ways. So as you heard on our farm, we literally share land with First Nations and settler farmer. And that's one of the ways that AFSA is supporting more land access and secure tenure. What we have found, and we were at a talk down the Mornington Peninsula recently, and there were some landholders there, what you were describing, people who were older, not using their land really to farm, but they're in the farming zone. And they were interested in making it available to younger emerging people who might farm it again. What we heard over the course of a conversation is that people are coming to that from very different spaces, and many of them are not very relational. They're transactional. So a lot of what was happening was kind of, could we transact a lease for these people, even if it was quite an affordable lease? And then do I have to interact much with these young farmers? What if they leave rubbish on my land? What if there were a number of things said that we realized we needed to keep going deeper in the conversation? Because like our land sharing agreement here with Champagnery starts with our relationship with Jendak and how we're all guided by the land as our boss. And decisions that we make have to be made in negotiation with Jendak. And the people who are starting some of those conversations thinking, oh, I'll just make some land available to some young people, actually find young people quite troublesome and don't really want to have much to do with them, even if they mean well. So I think this is like a much bigger conversation about our relationships with country and with each other. And to do this well, to redistribute land so it becomes fairer, is going to take like quite a lot of work on ourselves and together. There's a wonderful podcast some people would be aware of called Farmerama, and it had a 4-part series within it called Landed. And that landed part of the series of Farmerama takes place in Scotland, where they still have the croft system. Crofting is an increasingly lost land sharing method, but it's regaining favor in Scotland, particularly in the wilder kind of islands in the west, where there aren't as many people to have ruined it and where they have less speculators buying up land. And so that's an interesting thing. It comes from kind of feudal times, but still has held on through capitalist times and is now looking towards cooperative ownership. And I think we think a lot here at Joe and I about the idea of crofting, the idea that we can have plots that we're working and we have a level of autonomy with, then we have commons that we commonly worked together. We keep our households somewhere so that we can share resources, whether it's power and water or childcare. But that's what the crofting system has been doing for hundreds of years. And so there are models out there that still exist, and we're working back towards those. But being relational for me is like really core to how we're going to fix land access and tenure.
Thanks, Tammi. And thanks for talking about the work that AFSA are doing in terms of your First Peoples First movement. That kind of goes to a question that we had previously in the comments by Sari, talking about the implications of moving out onto land and how that relates to decolonisation. So hopefully that touches on that, Sari. And if you've got any more questions about that, I really encourage you to go to the AFSA website. They've got a lot of resources and talk a lot about that. Terry and Kerry, would you like to tackle the second part of that question, which talked about the role of growing food in urban spaces? We've had a couple more comments on that, one from Hildy, talking about the practicalities of growing in urban spaces. I don't know, Kerry, you previously, I think in your talk, you talked about research that had been done about the amount of land that's required for vegetables, and you've done a lot of work on that, Terry. But yeah, take it away.
I think I'll go straight to NENA's comment about how do we get access to public land to grow food, and just say that clearly, you have to negotiate that with councils, basically. I mean, but people also occupy and sort of squat on land and start community gardens in unused land in urban areas. And I suppose I think these are like, first adopters, pioneering efforts to learn to do agriculture and grow our own food locally. I mean, I'm aware of one I have quite a lot of contact with one in Sydney, which is in Leichhardt, where there was a park across the road from various people living in the street, and they first occupied it as the houses were built and were knocked down in the area that became the park. They occupied one of these blocks of land for a community garden and set up the Friends of White Creek's community garden, and then the different people had plots in that. And then sometime later, someone actually from the council suggested that they might like to do a food forest. So then they negotiated with the council to do that. So they run the food forest, and the council helps them to fund it. Not particularly a lot of money, but that's now been going, I'd say, probably about 5 years. And the community garden's probably been going for like 15 years or something. These are inspiring examples, and I think it's a matter of getting together 5 people who want to do this and sorting out your local area to see where you think it's feasible, and then contacting the relevant people who might be able to give you permission, or just starting to do it and then seeing how you go from there.
Did you have anything you'd like to add, Kerry?
Maybe just a couple of quick points. I think Terry's right. It depends. The big question is, how subversive do you want to be? I think in terms of vegetables, the only concern I would have myself is that in the summer, they require water. And also I'd be really disappointed for council to come and tear up a lot of hard work that's been done over a season, for instance. So that's one concern. In terms of contacting councils, there's a great story in Western Australia where they convinced the council that they would be allowed to plant fruit trees anywhere, and with very little, well, not anywhere, you'd have to ask the council, but it was a very easy process. The catch was that you didn't own the fruit, which obviously is also a great thing for us degrowthers as well, right? Now, not every council will allow that. Where I am, for instance, they have a long list of why they don't allow that. People might climb up and fall down, climb to get the fruit and fall down and hurt themselves. The fruit might land on someone's car. People might throw the fruit at other people. It's really it was really risk-averse response. And they said they weren't going to deal with it. But the experience in Western Australia was, they said, the person that really led that was, you just need to find one councillor that's going to support this and really bring it to the council meetings and eventually get the others on side. And it just takes a majority vote to change some of these rules around how land can be used in councils. But yeah, I'm all for the subversive approach as well. One thing I've been thinking about is that there actually is agricultural land in Melbourne suburbs that has been land banked. And it would potentially be an interesting project and a political statement as well to perhaps occupy this land. Some of this land has farming infrastructure as well in place, to use this land for actually growing food rather than it being land banked and used to make profits for someone when it's rezoned as residential. That might be a nice thing for a degrowth network to do. Who knows?
Yeah, the land that we're on with our farm is land banked, but it was land banked for a freeway. Yeah, it was one of the potential routes for the Northeast Link. It's been sitting empty for the past 15 years. And yeah, it was similar thing of we started off it with a legitimate lease and then extended out onto land that we didn't have the lease for. And then a couple of years later asked for the lease and they said, well, you're doing it already, so I guess we'll give it to you. Now, obviously you've got your hand up, Rog, but I'm still trying to get through the questions in the chat.
I've got a comment on the last bit. I know I've spoken before,
yeah,
but
go for it.
Yeah, I've been doing some of that stuff, urban cheeky stuff, maybe over sort of 10 or 20 years. And at first, that stuff about resistance from the old style council workers. And it ended up people kind of pushing it. And then council policies changed in some councils like Darebin and Moreland, and now kind of institutionalised your sort of, and formalised your kind of right to garden on your nature strip. And you know, they've brought in urban agricultural officers that try and facilitate some of the more interesting things in some of the other public spaces. And there's sort of a lot going on. And even somewhere I encountered over the years, one of the person who worked for the state government expansion of suburbia bureau, who was encouraging all the trees in the new subdivision to be food trees. So yeah, there's resistances and there's potentials, and it shows a lot that the relationship between the rat bag end and the more institutional change end, they're not necessarily opposites. I've got another thing that I'll come back later if everybody else has had a go, a different question about space on the edge of the city, but yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. We're going to have a bunch of time after the 7:30 mark to have a bit more of an informal discussion amongst us all. We've got 2 minutes before I know two of our speakers might need to feed their own communities. So I see you've got your hand up. Nisa, maybe we'll finish off with that question and then do the official roundup.
Yeah, well, I wanted to chuck mine in at the end because I wanted to see, I mean, maybe my bigger one that might be for anyone who can stay back after 7:30 is about, you know, so much of this is the beautiful stuff that we want and will keep making happen. But, you know, most of Australia is not doing that and probably won't anytime soon, given that Coles and Woolies is so convenient and shiny and all those things. And so I wanted to bring in the aspect of the collapse of the food system, how, you know, what are the crises that could happen, how, what's it called? Fragile is our food system. So maybe that can be a bigger chat for those that can stay back. But I did want to hear from everyone, all four of you, about what are things that people can do in the next kind of week, month, year to make this happen. as well as join the Degrowth Network to continue conversations and organise all together? That's my question.
Do you want to start us off, Tammi?
Yeah, I mean, my first response is always join. It's always collectivize. It's always that our individual actions are made far more powerful when they are collectivized. So whether you're joining the Degrowth Network, and it's hopefully going to start doing some very serious political lobbying around these matters, or joining AFSA, the Food Sovereignty Alliance, because we already do very serious lobbying around these matters. And if you haven't had a look, I would recommend checking out our People's Food Plan, the updated, it's our founding document. We're in the process of updating it, and it goes to the heart of a lot of these kind of policy reforms that we're all fighting for. So the best individual thing you can do is make yourself part of a number of people who are putting your weight behind things. That's the most impactful by far.
I totally agree with that. I don't have anything much to add to that. I think she's absolutely right about that. I mean, I'm not. I think I'm not in favor of trying to get the system to crash. You know, like it's like lots of people would die. I mean, I think it's going to crash anyway. We don't have to worry about that. You know, like just give it time. It's like in the meantime, obviously, you know, let's get started on these alternatives. You know, like yeah, as Tammy's just said. Anyway. That's just my comment. I am going to leave because, as you may see from the chat, various people in my house are going, well, what about dinner? So I may come back, but if not, it's been totally terrific, and thank you so much.
Thanks, heaps, Terry.
Okay.
Thanks, heaps, Terry. Would you like
right.
to comment on that, Kerry?
No, other than to agree with Tammi, join in on if you haven't already, on your local food networks and food sovereignty movements for sure. And other thing, eat more vegetables. Just eat heaps of vegetables.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we might stop the recording and say a huge thank you to Tammi and Kerry for taking the time to talk to us about what they do and their visions for the future and the present. I found it very, very useful. So yeah, thanks heaps.